Wow. So welcome everybody to the fourth and final President's Dream Colloquium. My name is Dana Leposki and I'm a professor of archaeology at Simon Fraser University. And I've had just the unbelievable pleasure of co-organizing this series on Indigenous people and local communities' perspectives on sustainability and resilience. And I've done that along with my amazing dean, where is she? Naomi Krogman, and it's been just amazing to work with you, Naomi. Naomi is the dean of the Faculty of Environment, and I can't imagine a more wonderful dean. So we're gathered here today on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Ts'msyen, and Musqueam nations. And for those many people who are joining us online, I encourage you to take a moment to think about the Indigenous people on whose territories you're residing right now. And for all of us, I want us to take a moment to think about what we're doing when we give a land acknowledgement. And what we're doing, it seems to me, is honoring the deep time history and knowledge that comes with being connected to specific places for countless generations. The joint talk tonight by Panikpak, Letitia, Pokiak, and Inuvialuit, Ts'msyen Greening, will give us a hint at the significance of such place-based knowledge in a range of realms, including battling current issues such as industrial colonization and climate change. I also want to take a moment to thank the David and Cecilia Ting Endowment for teaching, for sponsoring this event. So when I got asked by Naomi to help design this Dream Colloquium, I imagined that I wanted to start the series by listening to an elder, and as we did with Colloquium and Kwakwaka'wakw matriarch Kim Klutusi. And I wanted to do that to anchor our discussions in deep traditions. And I knew that I wanted to end the series by hearing from younger community members, as they're the ones who are and will be carrying their traditions forward in these changing ecological and social times. Thus, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Letitia and Spencer. And they're going to share a bit about their work and their journey with us from their respective communities. We're going to be hearing first from Letitia and then from Spencer. And there's going to be lots of time, I hope, for discussion with the audience about some of the themes that they raise. So I'm going to take a moment now to introduce Spencer, and then I'm going to turn it over to Natasha Lyons, my friend, who's an archaeologist and ethnobotanist and an impressive knowledge holder herself. And she's going to introduce Letitia, and then Letitia will talk first. So first, a few words to Spencer and about Spencer. In these topsy-turvy times, we've seen many false leaders emerge, people who use their privilege and ability to lie and manipulate to obtain and retain positions of power. True leaders are much harder to come by, however, and thus even more precious. True leaders are people who emerge as leaders because of their immense knowledge, their ability to learn from with others, and because of their passionate commitment to help people along a path. Despite Spencer's young years, he is such an emerging leader. This is reflected in his formal positions, such as him being the youngest ever band counselor of his community in Hartley Bay, and his role as a representative for his community at various government-to-government negotiating tables concerning the impact of industrial development on his traditional territory. All of Spencer's actions are guided by the advice and knowledge of his traditional leadership, and in fact, he's devoted his life as a Gitga'at scholar to documenting, to living by this knowledge. Spencer is passionate about being on the land, learning from his ancestral places, and then sharing those teachings to diverse communities. And he does that through scholarly papers, through classroom education, and through storytelling. Spencer is currently combining all these skills in his doctoral studies in the Faculty of Environment at SFU, where he's documenting through language, memories, oral tradition, and archaeology the interwoven and rich history of his people in the culturally significant watershed of Lac Alt-Sap in Gitga'at territory of northern BC. Throughout his research, he never stops asking, how will my work help my community? How can I bring about the most positive change? How can I best represent and share the knowledge I've been entrusted with? Importantly, Spencer's and Letitia's leadership in documenting the ancestral teachings of their people and the right to use that knowledge as a foundation for self-determination ultimately supports and bolsters the connections of Indigenous people globally to support them to manage and uphold their land and their traditions. There's never been a time in history when leaders such as Spencer and Letitia have been needed more. So we thank you both for being here tonight, for sharing your knowledge and your journeys with us.
Thank you, Dana. And it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague Panikpak, Letitia Pokiak. Letitia is an Inuvialuit scholar from Tuktoyaktuk, located in the Inuvialuit settlement region in the Canadian Western Arctic. She was raised traditionally in Inuvialuit Nunangat, the homeland of the Inuvialuit people. Letitia comes from a large and prominent, very well-known family that she is going to give more background to. So I will allow her to do that. Her family now and in the past is full of activists, scholars, knowledge holders, and expert land users. A very, very diverse and committed family, very well known. As an example, her uncle Randall Boogie Pokiak, who she's going to talk about and who recently passed on, was a well-known historian, negotiator, and signatory to the Inuvialuit Final Agreement, and later became the president of the Inuvialuit Development Corporation as it developed. Boogie was instrumental to Letitia's own knowledge and the award-winning thesis she ultimately produced at the University of Victoria, which focused on meaningful consultation in the land claims process. Like Spencer, she is committed to the service of her community and carefully chooses how she does that and how she makes her decisions around that. She is a proud mother of 3 children. And with that, I pass you on to Panikpak, Letitia Pokiak.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Awesome. Nakuyuk unugiak, uvanga panikpak Inuvialuit tara, tuktuyak tukmiu tauyunga. Unuguk twami, tuktuyak tumi. Good evening, my Inuvialuit name is Panikpak. I'm from Tuktoyaktuk, that is where I grew up. As an Inuvialuit, I respectfully acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, whose historical relationship with these lands and waters continue to this day. I currently live on the traditional territories of the Comox First Nation on Vancouver Island, whom I have huge respect for. This evening, I'll be sharing with you what sustainability and resiliency means to me as an Inuvialuit, how we have moved forward in a rapidly changing society, including climate change. Before I start, I should mention that what I share and present to you are my own perspectives. So to position myself as an Inuvialuit, the photos on the right are of my great-grandmother, Mamayak, my mom's mom's mom. Her family moved to the Inuvialuit settlement region from Alaska. The photos on the left are of my great-great-grandfather, Pokiak, who is my mom's dad's grandfather. It is said that he is the peacemaker between the Inuvialuit and the Gwich'in, whose territory borders to the south of Inuvialuit Nunangat. He is also said to be a founder of the town of Aklavik in the Inuvialuit settlement region during a time of encroachment by foreign traders, trappers, and whalers. The picture in the center is of my maternal grandparents, Igaluk and Angagak. The photo on the left is another one of my maternal grandmother, Mamayak, great-grandmother rather, and her son, Roy. Mamayak, as I mentioned, is mother to my Nanak, Igaluk, and Nanak is how we say grandmother in my language. The photo on the right is another one of my great-great-grandfather, Pokiak. Our family name of Pokiak is an anglicized version of his name, Pokiak. He actually raised my Dadak Angagak, and we say Dadak in my language for grandfather. I was raised traditionally in the sense that I was raised by my Nanak Igaluk. I grew up spending extended periods of time on the land, camping and subsisting as our ancestors had done for many generations before us, learning of what it means to be Inuvialuit. Though I was raised traditionally, I also attended Grolier Hall in Inuvik during my high school years because my hometown didn't have a high school at the time. It was the so-called end of the residential school era. Grolier Hall closed its doors in 1997. From then on, I eventually went to college and university, including grad school. My family and community have shaped my life in many ways. My traditional upbringing has shaped my connection to and respect for the lands and waters, my respect for knowledge holders, and my appreciation for traditional practices and traditional foods that sustain us. My lens and worldview stem from my upbringing, subsistence of the lands and waters, living in harmony with the seasons, and migrating wildlife that are the foundation for which I draw upon my identity as an Inuvialuit. Both my Dadak and Nanak witnessed and experienced a lot of changes during their time. The picture on the left is of my Dadak around the time that he was a special constable for the RCMP. In the photo on the right, he is preparing to harpoon a beluga whale, or kilalugak as we call them. The kilalugak continues to be a major staple in our Inuvialuit diet. My Dadak Angagak was a traditional man. He was raised traditionally, except for the few years that he attended residential school in Hay River, through which he learned to read and write. Angagak was one of many field workers for the Committee for Original Peoples Entitlement, or COPE, which I will talk more in the following slides. He noted that a harvester needs 400 miles in every direction in order to provide for a family. He was an experienced harvester and trapper. He was known for his humble influence and Pitkusimic Ilisamanik, or traditional knowledge. This slide is a close-up of the Tuktoyaktuk region and Husky Lakes, or Imaryuk as we call it. It's a map of place names that my Dadak recorded. These place names of many throughout the Inuvialuit settlement region exemplify Inuvialuit life in relation to the landscape. These places are significant for the various cultural activities and history that took place there. Practices on the lands and waters reinforce Inuvialuit culture, knowledge, and sovereignty that has carried us forward over many generations. Inuvialuit culture and knowledge are based on harvesting practices that occur on the lands and waters. Traveling on the land to various campsites and place names to harvest resources and practice cultural activities continues to be a way of Inuvialuit life. Not only does Inuvialuit Nanangat and the wildlife sustain us, but we also take care of the lands, waters, and the wildlife. As Inuvialuit, we have our own governance, our own teachings, historians and knowledge holders. We had our own medicine people, prophets and wise ones who provided counsel. You could even say that we had our own researchers and visionaries. Pitkusimic Ilisamanik has ensured Inuvialuit survival in the Arctic. It is shaped by connection to the land, where our worldview is formed based on the lived experiences of the people. Inuvialuit Nanangat are spaces filled with meaning and belonging, places where personhood is initiated and carved into being. Inuvialuit have traveled and subsisted on homeland since time immemorial. Sentiments of place and the notion of embodied wellness, or holistic well-being, speak to the heart of what indigeneity is based upon, which are that identity is tied to places, personhood to culture, wellness to country food, and relationship to lands and animals. So in the late 1960s and 70s, oil and gas reserves were explored for and discovered on Inuvialuit homelands. The federal government tried to propose a development. They tried to develop a gas pipeline from the outskirts of my hometown of Tuk all the way down to Alberta. Inuvialuit livelihood was disrupted. Hunters and trappers united and formed the Committee for Original Peoples Entitlement, or COPE, to organize themselves against government and industry. Inuvialuit became a formidable force through COPE, which rallied at the grassroots level. During his elderly years, my Dadak Angagak was one of many field workers for COPE who assisted in the Regional Land Use and Occupancy Project. translating for and interviewing Inuvialuit regarding their traditional subsistence areas and homelands, giving harvesters voice and acknowledging their way of life. Angagak recognized the political struggle that the Inuvialuit would have to undertake to assert sovereignty and authority over homelands. Inuvialuit way of life and sovereignty are not only tied to the lands and waters, but they are also tied to the outside forces that our elders rose up against. Prior to contact and encroachment, Inuvialuit were the political authority in the Inuvialuit settlement region, autonomous with exclusive rights and to certain territories and resources. Inuvialuit personhood, pedagogy, spirituality, culture, and well-being derive from the land. In order for Inuvialuit to maintain a way of life and sovereignty, an uprising against government and industry was necessary, as the lands hold important social, religious, and legal dimensions. This quote was taken from Northern Frontier, Northern Homeland, the report of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry, Volume 1, by Justice Thomas Berger. Berger was commissioned by the federal government to determine whether the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline would be feasible, not only for the sustainability of the environment, but also for the socioeconomic and cultural impacts that the people would experience, peoples whose region the pipeline would be intersecting. Berger meaningfully consulted with each Indigenous group and community along the proposed pipeline corridor, recording their way of life and the potential impacts the pipeline development would bring. Essentially, he brought moral and ethical dimensions into his work, moral and ethical dimensions that should be at the heart of any form of consultations and policymaking. During Berger's inquiry, my dad stated, quote, "In a clavik a lot of for them days, just like you white people working for wages and you have money in the bank. Well, my bank was here all around with the fur. Whatever kind of food I wanted, if I wanted caribou, I'd go up in the mountains. If I wanted colored fox, I went up in the mountain. In the Delta, I get mink, muskrat, but I never make a big trapper. I just get enough for my own use the coming year. Next year, the animals are going to be there anyway. That's my bank," end quote. Angagak didn't take more than what he needed to ensure that the lands, waters, and wildlife would be protected for future Inuvialuit. The photo on the left is of my dad sharing knowledge during the Berger inquiry. Angagak knew of the political struggle Inuvialuit would need to undertake to intersect the discourse and encroachment of colonial forces. He and other Cope field workers consulted with each Inuvialuit household for their subsistence areas and place names. The Inuvialuit final agreement was signed on June the 5th, 1984, in my hometown of Tak. It took 14 years of consultations and negotiations, a war of words with the government, as my Uncle Randall called it. Inuvialuit rights and freedoms and our well-being became entrenched in the Canadian Constitution with specified measures and protection of Inuvialuit nationhood. This agreement brought Inuvialuit into terms with the notion of a modern sovereignty. As expressed in my thesis, my Uncle Randall stated, quote, "The sovereignty is a domestic sovereignty, not between countries. It was within Canada. This is our homeland. I call it a sovereignty within a sovereignty." So we've got protection from Canada, from outside invaders like Russia, United States, and other countries. And we've also got sovereignty within our own nation, end quote. So here's a photo of my Uncle Randall, or Boogie as we called him, at the far right, while he was a negotiator for COPE. The IFA would be a moment in Inuvialuit and Canadian history that acknowledged the original people, the Inuvialuit, as having formal land rights, political and legal agency, and a voice in matters that are at the heart of Inuvialuit well-being. The tenets of the IFA are simple, yet effective, and are open to interpretation. The goals of the IFA are to preserve Inuvialuit cultural identity and values within a changing northern society, to enable Inuvialuit to be equal and meaningful participants in the northern and national economy and society, and to protect and preserve the Arctic wildlife, environment, and biological productivity. In the following slides, I portray how these tenets are put into practice and how Inuvialuit are carving their way forward as a people, addressing various colonial and climate impacts. This map demonstrates the boundaries of the Inuvialuit settlement region as negotiated between COPE and the federal government. We have 6 communities and 3 national parks within the ISR. The 3 parks are highlighted in green. They are sanctuaries to wildlife populations that Inuvialuit depend upon and continue to maintain relationship with through co-management boards and harvesting. Wildlife populations and their health depend upon the health and conditions of the environment that they migrate through and subsist off of. The Arctic, as I will show you, is heavily impacted by climate change. In terms of sovereignty, I engaged with the term used as my uncle Randall Pokiak had stated. He described it as a sovereignty, described sovereignty as being in control of our own homelands and its natural resources. He applied it to mean Inuvialuit sovereignty within the sovereign nation of Canada, through which Inuvialuit have the formal protection of Canada. He also referred to it as Canada's commitment to engage with and include Inuvialuit in matters that pertain to Inuvialuit, primarily with regards to land and wildlife management. Essentially, Inuvialuit have given voice to the wildlife, to the land and waters, and affirmed sovereignty by doing so. Randall shared with me what the elders advised and was envisioned by the prophet Isilik, whose memory and wisdom lives on in the elders. As remembered by Randall, Isilik advised, quote, "Don't let anybody else control you in your own homeland. You're going to have to fight for it. These Kablunak, in that war of words, won't listen to you as Inuvialuit. Give voice to the wildlife, give voice to the environment, give voice to the ocean, to the land. Become the voice of these that you know so well. Because the wildlife are not only going to sustain you for food, they're going to help you get sovereignty." So in my thesis, I argued that meaningful consultation was a significant factor in the signing of the Inuvialuit Final Agreement. It was not only the consultation by Justice Thomas Berger, but consultation that was conducted by COPE as well. The IFA enables us to preserve our Inuvialuit identity and culture and to carve out our own future. Justice Thomas Berger's report of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry is poignant for the manner in which he consulted with Indigenous communities along the pipeline corridor, which was rigorous and genuine. His inquiry exemplifies how consultation with Indigenous peoples is done in a good way. This enabled him to see how important it was to put a 10-year moratorium on the development of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, which paved the way for Inuvialuit to continue negotiations with the federal government. These are photos that I took one summer during a visit home for a family reunion. These are just a few examples of the country foods that we still depend upon. Oh, I'm missing a slide. Okay, that's okay. Moving on. Here are a few photos. That's so weird. There should be a picture of ukpiks, as we call them, cloudberries, as well as cranberries. No, not flipped. So I'm just going to continue. So I'm just going to read the notes from that slide. So not only do we monitor the wildlife populations, but we are present at any decision-making table when it comes to co-management, policymaking, and potential development. For instance, any industrial development proposals, including one submitted by the Inuvialuit ourselves, go through a rigorous environmental impact screening process and are reviewed by Inuvialuit. Currently, Inuvialuit are exercising food sovereignty in the traditional activities that continue today. It was the exercising of land use and food sovereignty that was instrumental in the achievement of the Inuvialuit Final Agreement. I took these photos during my visit home this past summer. I was fortunate to work on whitefish in the making of Vipsy. Traditional knowledge such as this has been passed down through many generations. That is not to say, though, that food security is a given. There are many families that go without traditional foods due to knowledge loss or the erosion of cultural practices, which are linked to the impacts of colonialism and its rampant exploitation and extraction of resources. What complicates food security further is that healthy foods and the equipment needed to hunt and harvest are costly and challenging for families to provide, or to afford rather. The climate crisis has altered Inuvialuit subsistence, occasionally making it challenging, dangerous even, for traditional knowledge transfer to occur from one generation to the next. It's becoming more challenging and dangerous. So as you can imagine, Inuvialuit way of life and food security are impacted by the climate crisis. This is a photo that I took in the summer of 2019. Over the years, the crashing waves caused the beach and land to erode. Efforts were made to slow the erosion by putting huge boulders along the shore, but that just stalled the erosion temporarily. A few houses along this west shore of Tuk were moved inland in 2020. Erosion of the lands are happening at alarming rates due to the melting permafrost. The timing of the seasons are altered, both in conditions and in consistency. The animals are affected, thereby affecting the timing and practices of Inuvialuit subsistence. Each of these points highlighted are direct impacts due to climate change that are happening in the Arctic. Impacts include, but are not limited to, coastal land erosion, permafrost melting, rising temperatures, rising waters, unpredictable weather. Wildlife are affected. Plants, insects, and wildlife are moving further north. Traditional knowledge, as I mentioned, that transfer is now becoming dangerous. There has been a loss of campsites and cabins, and there has been an increase in marine traffic through Arctic waters. Being powerless to the elements, a vital need for adaptation is necessary.